Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this little video talk. I'm Dr. Tom Sykes. I teach creative writing here at the university. I'm sorry I couldn't have been with you last week in person in the session, but I was quite ill. As you probably know, there's quite a lot of it going around at the moment. So what I thought I'd do as a sort of an alternative for you would be to do a little kind of online class, online talk about some of the ideas that I think are important really with regards to the kind of writing that I'm interested in and teach, and I hope you will be interested in as well. And the title of this talk is called Writing About Yourself Can Be Good for You, with a question mark. I'm posing that as a question, but I'm hoping by the time you've sort of engaged with this particular video, you'll start to see that as more of a statement. We can take the question mark away. And really I want to, because this is a module that deals with kind of practical skills, I want to kind of really look at writing as a practical skill, really, and as a skill that not only gives you all kinds of academic and professional advantages, but that also maybe gives you a number of personal advantages as well, and can be seen as a kind of life skill, the skill that makes your life easier and living your life easier. If you know, supposing you want to kind of work at it and study it and get better at it, really. So I'm just going to begin with a couple of thoughts about, you know, often the question is asked of those of us who are writers, why be a writer? What's the point of it? Why be a writer instead of, you know, a milkman or an astronaut or someone who builds dry stone walls? And it's a really good question, and often it's hard to answer. You know, a lot of writers will say, I'd write because I just have to, you know, because I just have this kind of powerful urge to, this craving to. But actually, I think there are a number of reasons. I've been a professional writer since my mid-20s. I'm now in my early 40s. Yes, I'm an old fart. So I've been writing all kinds of things for almost 20 years. I mean, I was writing before. I was writing from as soon as I could hold a pen. But in terms of yeah, making a living at writing, that's really occupied most of my adult life. And it's a nice way to earn a living, to earn money. Now I teach writing a lot of the time, but I still write books and articles, and I edit books, and I run a writing website as well. So all my work is sort of writing related, or it is directly, you know, involves writing. But I've been doing a lot of thinking over the years about sort of how different my life might have been if I hadn't been a writer, if I hadn't made that decision, if I'd gone into some other line of work. And I think it has, I like to think it's improved me to some extent, at least, in certain ways. And I think that it improves other people in certain ways, not all of the time, not for all people, of course. These are not hard and fast fixed rules, but I think, you know, being a good writer can lead to being a good citizen and a more fulfilled human being. What do I mean by that? I think as individuals, we live in societies, in groups, in communities. We have to make decisions on behalf of those communities. We have to decide how it is that we sort of interact with other people and how we act in unison with other people, whether this is about voting in elections or whether it's about the kind of you know, joining certain organizations, you know, your neighborhood watch or local grassroots campaigns. If, you know, in Portsmouth, there are many of those. I noticed there are groups like Keep Milton Green. There are groups that are sort of trying to challenge decisions made by government, you know, new buildings and new property developments and things like that. And I think if you do the kind of writing that I do, which we'll get into in more detail in terms of defining what that is in a moment, but I'll just give you a little potted definition, which is sort of really writing about my own experiences and writing about the world. world, things that go on in the world, political and social affairs and things like that. If you do that kind of writing, I think it necessarily means that you will hopefully be more aware of the world and the news and things that are going on around you. And I think that that can be only a good thing. I think it's better to be informed and to be mindful of and knowledgeable about the world than to live in a sort of state of ignorance. And as I say, if you are informed, you can make hopefully better decisions as a citizen in those ways that I just mentioned. I think also on a much more personal level, an interpersonal level, if you can get good at writing, writing is communicating. Nobody writes just for themselves. Everybody's looking for an audience. Everyone is looking for a way to communicate with somebody else. Hopefully as many people as possible will read your work, will buy your books, will come to your website, view your blog, etc., etc. And I think the better you get at writing, the better you become as a communicator in other areas of life. Think about how many problems there are when, in terms of the disagreements, misunderstandings, arguments that happen between friends and family members, within workplace situations, within, dare I say, schools and colleges and universities. I think that if more people practiced writing and learned how to write well, that would have a good knock-on effect in terms of how they communicate, how they use language in their day-to-day interactions with people, conversations and discussions with other people. I think also, if you understand how language works, which is one of the many pleasant byproducts of getting better at writing, you understand how language can be used and abused. You can start to, I think, protect yourself a little bit against those forces in our society that would try to manipulate you or trick you or indoctrinate you in one way or another, whether we're talking about, political communication, or whether we're talking about certain kinds of advertising, or certain kinds of content online that try to make you pay money for things that maybe you shouldn't pay money for, or believe things that are less than rational. I think if you understand how language works, how rhetoric, which is how language is used to make an argument, is used to persuade people of a certain case or a belief or an idea, then you will kind of immunize yourself against, as I say, these sorts of bad actors in our society that would try to kind of con you or trick you into believing, this, that, or the other. And also and this is just quite a basic kind of point really, which is certainly from my experience, I've led a much more interesting life since I made a decision to become a writer. A lot of my writing has involved traveling all over the world. I've been quite lucky in that regard. I've written books about Ivory Coast, which is a nation in West Africa. I've written now 2 books about the Philippines in Southeast Asia. My work as a sort of travel journalist and as a foreign correspondent has taken me to all parts of Europe. I've been to Mexico. I've been to other parts of Africa, such as Ghana, many parts of Asia, India, China, various other nations in that particular continent. And I think even if you leave aside travel, I think, if you're always looking for a story, if you're always looking for subject matter to write about, it will compel you, it will motivate you to get out into the world and to talk to people and to, try to find out about the world, try to find out its kind of unusual or stranger aspects, try to find those eccentric characters that maybe, not everybody is interested in talking to. Maybe try to go to those sort of parts of towns or cities or villages that are kind of, have been forgotten about or overlooked by other people. So yes, all of which leads to, I hope, leading, that you will lead a more interesting life. I just want to sort of say something now about the kind of some of the benefits of writing for one's well-being and one's kind of personal mental health and maybe physical health too, because of course those two things are very much connected. This gentleman here is called Oscar Wilde. He's one of my favorite writers. He was an Irish dramatist and poet and a very, very funny man, but also a very, very intelligent and sort of politically astute commentator as well. And he made this comment, he had this kind of view, which was summed up by this phrase, all art is quite useless. Now, Wilde is famously kind of mischievous in his kind of the way that he used language and ironic in the way that he used language. Now, when he wrote all art is quite useless, he didn't mean that art was a waste of time and nobody should do it and that it was sort of rubbish. Of course he wouldn't. This is someone who made a very good career for himself as an artist, as a writer, yes. What he meant by that was that, and I'm going to give you another quote that sort of qualifies that to a certain extent. A work of art is useless as a flower is useless. A flower blossoms for its own joy. We gain a moment of joy by looking at it. So it's not that art is useless completely, as in pointless, as in there's no reason to engage in it or create it or appreciate it. What is meant by that, what he meant by that, is that it has a kind of impact or an importance that isn't to do with the kind of ordinary uses that we assign to things. You know, it's not about making money or achieving something sort of concrete and clear in the world. It's not instrumental in the way that, you know, a scientist will kind of do an experiment in order to gain some kind of tangible result or kind of product from it, right? It's the fact that art is sort of something that is its own reward, is that it kind of brings joy, it brings pleasure to the creator, but also hopefully to those who view or appreciate or consume the art. We can, this isn't just about, you know, memoir writing, which is my kind of area, or writing, you know, writing about the real world. We can talk, you know, this applies to novels and poems and films and comic books and, dare I say, podcasts and other art forms, photography, illustration, graphic design, filmmaking, etc., etc. Now, to kind of take this this idea a little bit further, I wanted to cite a psychologist called Gabor Mate. Oscar Wilde was, as you can see from the photo, was around some time ago. He lived in the late 19th century, but Gabor Mate is a contemporary sort of psychiatrist or psychologist, and he talks about how when you are writing, you get into this sort of extraordinary sort of mental space where you forget about everything else in your life. It's a bit like when children play, you know, when children sort of play around, and you'll remember this when you were younger, I certainly do, like you'd go off and play in the garden or wherever, you know, wherever your kind of space was, and you'd forget time, you'd forget, you know, the sort of ordinary kind of structures of life, and your mum or your dad or whoever might sort of call out and say, it's dinner time, come in for dinner. And you'll be like, wow, had we spent that long, like just mucking around in a sandpit or whatever? Like you lose track of time, you lose track of the kind of, you know, the reality of the rest of the world, if you like. Now, Mate calls that a flow state. You know, you get into this sort of extraordinary, and some people achieve it through meditation. I have a good friend who practices mixed martial arts, and when he's training in his martial arts, for his martial arts, he you know, gets into this kind of, yeah, this flow state where it's about being completely absorbed in the activity that you're doing. Now, it's important with writing and creativity that flow state, what's crucial to that flow state is that it, you know, as Wilde says, it should not be about achieving some tangible end. If you're writing because you're hoping to make some money out of it. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. I've made a living myself for many years, but it's not really the point. The main point of writing, if we're going to do it, if you're going to do it for maximum well-being benefits, is that you're not really doing it for any reason. If you're doing it for money, that's not a good reason. If you're doing it because you're hoping that it might impress people and make you popular, or impress someone so that they will fancy you, that also is not quite the point. There needs to be, the point is that there needs to be no point for this flow state, for this extraordinary kind of benefit, this meditational sort of benefit to the mind and the spirit can be appreciated. I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit complex, but it's something in a way that you just have to try doing to understand it. It's something that is difficult to explain by definition, really, because it is a sort of a feeling, a mental space that is hard to kind of summarize in words. But as I say, it is a recognized thing, and that's why the likes of Wilde and Mate and many people way cleverer than I have tried to describe and understand this. Something else I want to say is that storytelling runs deep into what it means to be a human being, I think. It has been, some people will argue, and this, I'm going to be referencing an excellent recent book by Jack Hart, who's a sort of veteran American journalist and editor, worked for all the kind of big titles in the US. And he's written this book called Storycraft, which is subtitled The Complete Guide to Writing Narrative Nonfiction. Now, he talks about how storytelling is hardwired into our brains. It's something that really from the earliest days, the earliest period of kind of human evolution, we started to, storytelling became very kind of important to us as a species, as a certain kind of animal. He says that telling stories gives us an edge, a way of perceiving the world that has helped us to survive. So the fact that human beings have survived, whereas so many other species of animals have not, we can think about the dodo, we can think about, I believe that there are way more species that have not survived when compared to all the species that we have on our planet that have survived. So when you think about that, it's a pretty stiff competition. The fact that anyone is here is kind of miraculous. You, me, anyone alive has sort of won this extraordinarily competitive game, if you like, of natural selection. So he says that one of the key ways that human beings survived to evolve to get to the point where we are now, where we, for good or for bad, and I think in many cases it's a bad thing, that we dominate the earth, because we're doing a lot of damage to it and we're not treating the earth probably as well as we should do. But be that as it may, the fact that we're here has been much to do with our need and our kind of attraction and attachment to storytelling and writing by extension. So the anthropologist Daniel Smith, just to sort of go into a little bit more of this argument about how important storytelling has been to the evolution of human beings, talks about how storytelling promotes social cooperation, mating success, social status and sharing, all behaviors with obvious evolutionary benefits. So you can see that now, when you see people trying to impress someone that they have a romantic attraction to, they tell stories, we tell anecdotes and jokes in the hope that people will laugh and like us as a result of that. And then that way we kind of obtain some, I don't know, status, or I don't like the word status so much, but some appreciation, some respect from people. We know this, I think, to be true in our own interpersonal kind of interactions with people. And the other thing is that scientists have got in on this, that in recent years, scientists have become, particularly neuroscientists, scientists who study the brain, have become very interested in the power of storytelling. And they found that through all kinds of experiments and kind of lab work, that the brain is more receptive to narratives that deliver a clear message to a majority of readers. So, it's not just about telling stories, it's about telling clear stories that kind of follow certain conventions. And we're going to talk about what those conventions are shortly. And just to say a little bit more about writing as therapy, given that how writing and storytelling is so kind of hardwired into us as human beings, it can only be natural, it can only be healthy for us to develop our capacities as storytellers and as writers, right? So we can talk about our own lives as narratives. Many people do that, and certain psychologists, according to Hart again, now urge the use of storytelling to reconstruct self-identities in the wake of traumatic brain injury. So when people have injured their brains and they've perhaps forgotten things about who they are, fundamental things about who they are, what is important to them, who is important to them, they've maybe, forgotten about their relatives and their loved ones. Storytelling is a kind of therapy that is used because it is so essential to human beings' understanding of themselves, of their own identity. If you think about it, someone asks the question, who are you? Very often the answer you'll give will be in the form of a story. You might go back to, well, I was born in whatever year and I grew up here, my parents were. You're telling a story about yourself. Even if you answer in a kind of way that's not a kind of chronological rundown of your life, you're going to tell a story of some kind, aren't you? You're going to tell a story that kind of illustrates. If you think that you're a particularly kind person, and I'm sure you all are, everyone watching this, you might, to sort of evidence that or to show that to somebody, you might tell a story about, some volunteer work that you've done, or the way that you helped a younger brother or sister at school or with their homework or whatever it might be. And I just want to give you one more. I don't want to bombard you with too many quotes, but there are a lot of people who can sort of put this better than I can, so I think might as well give them the floor. So there's a writer called Patricia Hampel who has this quote, and I'm just going to read it out to you because I think it's quite telling. Our capacity to move forward as developing beings rests on a healthy relationship with the past. So when we're dealing with difficulties in our lives, traumas or things that have upset us or made us anxious or made us depressed, we're a lot of that is really to do with the relationship between the kind of past and the present and the future, isn't it? Like, in order to move on from those unpleasant things that have happened in the past, you have to have a kind of reckoning with yourself at this moment now, and you have to think about, well, what can I do in the future to improve a pretty, unpleasant situation, for example. Just to continue with the Hampel quote, psychotherapy, that widespread method for promoting mental health, relies heavily on memory and on the ability to retrieve and organize images and events from the personal past. If we learn not only to tell our stories, but to listen to what our stories tell us, to write the first draft and then return for the second draft, we are doing the work of memory. So, as she says, psychotherapy, our endeavors to try to kind of solve the problems that we have that stem from past experiences involve thinking about the past, meditating and reflecting on the past. Writing is simply that, really, is simply reflecting on the past. By doing that, we might come to some better understandings of the past, which help us then to kind of move forward into the future in a more positive way. Okay, so having talked about some of the reasons why writing is good for you, or I hope will be good for you, I want to give you some brief advice about writing as well as you possibly can, and doing this job of kind of therapeutic writing or writing for self-improvement as well as you possibly can. Now, the first thing I think that's worth thinking about is when you do a piece of writing, you do a sort of short memoir piece, an anecdote about your life and art, whatever it might be, it's worth thinking, putting a lot of thought into the structure and design, if you like, of a piece of writing. Now, the picture there you've got there, sorry, it's a little bit, has turned out a little bit kind of hazy and pixelated, but it's, as you can see, it's a scaffolding that someone is using to fix or build a house, yeah? And I think it's worth thinking about, anyone who builds a house has to kind of think logically about which, this brick needs to go there, this window needs to go there. I'm talking as if I know the first thing about building a house. I don't, but I happen to have relatives who are builders who have educated me about these things. I think if we can take that kind of structural attitude towards writing, it will benefit us and we will come up with better writing. So a lot of the time it's about thinking about, where do you begin a piece of writing? Now, a lot of us just do that unconsciously. We just sort of go, and off we go, and we start writing. Certainly those of us who have done exams before, you don't have time necessarily to think hard about, how can I begin this piece of writing in a really sort of attractive, eye-opening, catchy way. You just dive in and you're up against the clock, and you've got to get what get your thoughts and your knowledge down on the page. Well, writing well can't be like that. I think writing well has to be about putting some thought and some planning into how you're going to structure and order your ideas in a piece of writing. Now, so it's worth thinking about where you begin and where you end, but it's also worth thinking about what specific tools and devices and methods are available to you for these purposes, for the purposes of making a piece of writing. What you're always trying to do with a piece of writing is you're trying to capture the attention of the reader from the very beginning. If you don't do that, you're not doing your job properly, I would argue. And what that involves doing is, there are various kinds of options open to you for that. You can start by telling a joke. I think the way to think about it is to try to get some kind of emotional reaction from the reader, whatever that might be. The only thing you don't want to be doing is to bore the reader. That is the cardinal sin of writing. You don't want to ever be boring the reader. So if you put some thought into how you start a piece of writing, can it be a joke? Can I make them laugh? Can I bring them joy? Can I make them scared? Can I give them some piece of information that will kind of shock them? I mean, we know this, that there are whole genres of writing, horror and crime fiction, that is really about sort of trying to trigger those darker emotions within people. Can you start with a kind of puzzle or a sort of curious bit of information that will maybe inspire or provoke the reader to read on and want to find out more, to unravel this mystery or this puzzle? And then you want to think about the ending as well of a piece of writing. How do you kind of tie up your ideas? How can you leave the reader? I think you can engage the reader at the beginning on an emotional level, but it's also worth thinking about what emotional tone or note you want the reader to be left with. If you want to leave them with a kind of feeling of anger, or a feeling of injustice, or a feeling of like, right, I want to do something about this. Do you want to leave them smiling, leave them frowning? Worth thinking about all these things. Just to give you a little bit more about, I've sort of jumped ahead of myself a little bit and given you some examples already, but we can talk about when you're trying to hook the reader in. That's not a bad way of looking at this. Get the reader interested and involved from the very beginning of your piece of writing. Talked about puzzle or mystery. You can have an anecdote that illustrates the story's theme. You can begin with a little piece of personal experience that seems to kind of just sum up the overall kind of point that you're trying to make with the story or the article. You can begin with an engaging fact or quote. You can begin with a direct question of the reader. You can say, well, what do you think of this? What do you, I challenge you, reader, to sort of be thinking about the issues that I'm going to raise, or to disagree with me, or to agree with me. And then I've mentioned an emotional provocation, whether you make them laugh or cry or frown or angry or fired up about something, is also an option. Something else to bear in mind is what I call the angle. And this applies to memoir writing, autobiography, and various kinds of journalism, I would say. And it's about what every writer has a subject, whether it's food or travel or a particular travel destination, or a particular period in history, or a particular period in your personal life, your childhood, your teenage years, whatever it might be. But you have to bear in mind that many, many, many millions, if not billions of other writers have dealt with those topics themselves previously. The question is how are you going to deal with that topic in a way that's different to everything that's come before? Now, nothing is entirely original, of course. We all are influenced by our heroes, by our literary heroes and heroines, right? But we can always find a variation on a theme. We can always do what Neil Gaiman, who's a famous writer originally from Portsmouth, in fact, a bit of trivia there for you, wrote the Sandman comics and American Gods novel and things like that. He says, tell the story that only you can tell. Yeah. So I think it's very, very important. What is the story that only you can tell? And I think some adjectives here to kind of, you know, some ideas here to kind of help you think through how you can arrive at an original angle is, you know, it needs to be unique. It needs to be different from what else is out there. It needs to be as original as possible. It needs to be what we call newsworthy or timely. You know, is there something going on in the world, some buzz around a particular issue or subject that you can be tapping into? You know, often when there's an anniversary of a war or the death of someone famous or the birth of someone famous, you'll find a huge flurry of articles and stories and films and documentaries that sort of come out in order to kind of tap into the buzz that is around that particular event in time, you know. Sometimes being controversial, being kind of disagreeable, challenging people can be a way to finding an original angle, you know, offering the kind of an unpopular or unusual view of the world. I think tends to be a bit more fear of doing that these days, because I think for probably all sorts of complex reasons, but one would be the fear that people have of being kind of trolled or attacked on social media. You know, very often there's a kind of group think, isn't there, across, you know, whatever kind of political, you know, on the left, the right and the center, there's a sort of group think, a way that you must sort of think and conform to the thoughts and views of many other people in that particular kind of tribe, or you end up, if you don't do that, you end up risking being kind of, you know, humiliated or attacked online or insulted or whatever it might be. The other thing as well is to be really careful with your words as a writer. I mean, that might sound obvious, but it's about understanding the power of words. I'm just going to quote here the great Chinese American writer Amy Tan. The English language contains roughly 1 million words, and each has a specific meaning. There are key differences between famous and infamous, jealous and envious, adverse and averse. As writers, it's important to learn the differences that distinguish words and invest time to select the correct one. Doing so improves precision and clarity. The nature of writing is such that one slight misspelling or bad choice of word, if you don't quite get the word for the right job, the meaning and the impact of the whole piece of writing can be damaged. So we have to be perfectionist about this. You know, just like a surgeon has to get exactly the right cut, you know, with the scalpel when they're doing an operation, or that could be the difference between life and death. Okay, getting the right word for a piece of writing does not make the difference between life and death, of course, but it's still very important. You know, it still makes the difference between a kind of a piece of writing that's, you know, accessible and enjoyable to an audience or not. Another thing that's really important, and you'll probably hear this phrase if you go forward and do more creative writing studies. I mean, I hope you do at your time, either here or wherever you go on to do further study. And it's show, don't tell is this kind of phrase, which has become a bit of a cliche, admittedly, but some cliches have the virtue of actually being sensible and important to understand, I think. So use active, simple language that provides detailed description rather than abstractions and generalizations is really what show don't tell is about. And I'll give you an example in a moment of the benefits of showing versus telling. Just to quote V.S. Naipaul, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, so I think we can sort of assume that he knows at least a little bit about writing. He said, the beginner should avoid using adjectives except those of color, size, and number. Use as few adverbs as possible. So it's about being brief and clear and not sort of waffling or using too many words. You know, I think that sometimes there's this belief amongst certain people who are kind of maybe new to writing that they think, well, the more words I can dump into a sentence, the clearer the picture will be. But actually the opposite is the case very often. Let's look at two examples. The field was pretty and colourful. These are two examples, by the way. These are two ways of describing the same phenomenon. Let's imagine two writers have gone to a place, have gone to a field, and they've looked at the field and they thought, okay, I'm going to describe that field. The first writer writes, the field was pretty and colourful. Then the second writer, and this is an actual quote from Colin Fubron, who's a major travel writer of the 20th century, still going now, I should say, 21st century as well. So his response would be, mosses, thick grass, and a weft of mauve and yellow wildflowers covered the dark soil. So there are immediately all kinds of differences, aren't there? If we say that this is telling, this example here, the field was pretty and colourful, is an example of telling, and mosses, thick grass, etc., is an example of showing. Now, the main difference there, I use the analogy of the difference between a kind of HD TV picture of something, yeah, where you can make out textures, details, colors, shades, etc. That's the Thubron one, yeah. When Thubron, we can immediately get a picture in our heads, can't we? A clear picture of what he's experienced and where he's been. You know, mosses, that's a certain type of plantation. We all know what moss looks like. It's a sort of cushion-like, sort of fluffy kind of thing, isn't it? Thick grass, well, we know there are blades of grass, so we can, you know, this mental picture that we have is starting to be populated with objects. You know, we're thinking of these kind of, you know, I'm imagining these thick, sharp blades of grass and a weft of mauve and yellow wildflowers. Well, we know what flowers look like. They tend to have buds and petals and things like that. And mauve and yellow, well, that's some helpful colors there for us to kind of get the picture more clear in our heads. And then these cover the dark soil. So we're imagining there's another layer of detail here, which is the sort of dark soil underneath the mosses and the different types of plantation, right? Whereas the top one, the field was pretty and colourful. I think when we read a description like that, okay, we get it's a field, but beyond that, we can't see anything. You know, it's a very hazy, misty sort of pre-HD TV. It's not even it's worse than that. It's a bit like our parents' or grandparents' generation when they had their TVs. If you've ever had the misfortune to see a TV from the 1950s or 60s, it was appallingly bad. It was black and white, first of all, and it looked like there was a snowstorm going. You try and watch a football match and you could bet, is that, like, whose side is it? Is that Manchester United? Is that Liverpool? I can't figure it out. So it's, for me, the difference between these sort of descriptions in words is all the difference between a kind of very sort of misty, imprecise kind of old-fashioned TV screen or picture and the kind of ultra HD, very detailed kind of modern TV picture, if you like. Okay, I'm going to finish now with a little activity that I'd like you to do in your own time, just to kind of hopefully make some of the points I've tried to make to you today, share with you today, a little bit clearer. And I think sometimes we tend to learn more about writing and about anything really if we have a chance to kind of put it into practice ourselves. So this is an activity, a writing activity that I get to do with my students. It tends to be quite popular. It's called Details, Details. And I'd like you to first of all think about a place that you've traveled to that excited you. It can be human-made, it can be natural, it can be a mountain, a park, a volcano, a desert, a beach, or it can be a shopping center, you know, a house belonging to a relative or, you know, friend. It can be a shed, it can be any place, as long as it's a sort of specific place that you have in mind. I don't want you just to write generally about beaches that you've been to, or generally about you know, branches of Sports Direct that you've visited. I want you to think about a specific place. So I want you to do that, and then first of all, I want you to write down 2 or 3 sites that come to you that associate with you, just in note form, visual details about this place. Don't generalize, be very specific about colors, shades, size, corners, shapes, textures, in the way that I just explained with the whole show don't tell issue. So especially if there are things that are unusual or seem somehow kind of visually poetic or beautiful to you. So I'll give you examples from some of my own writing. This is from my book about the Philippines, one of my books about the Philippines. Ribbons of bougainvillea brightened the traffic islands. Well-groomed men in shorts sold helium balloons with Disney characters on them. This is my description of a particular very busy road in Manila that I used to live near. Okay, so take a few minutes to write down 2 or 3 sites, visual details that sort of you associate with this place. You can pause this video if you want, and then carry on when you want, but I'm just going to go forward because it seems like a bit of a sort of a weird thing to do, just for me to sit silently for a few minutes and then carry on. So the next thing is to jot down some of the sounds that you associate with the place, not just the obvious and the most memorable, you know, subtle ones that might form the kind of background noise to this particular place, as well as the really obvious ones. So the ringing of bells, the plashing of a fountain, children's laughter from out of sight, the draft of lager filling up, the drone of a plane flying overhead, anything like that. Then moving on, taste. Think about maybe some food that you consumed in or near this place. Food evokes place in a really kind of visceral way, I think. So what tastes did you encounter in this particular location? You want to try to describe tastes, what things taste like, but also temperature and feel of food in the mouth. If you can try to capture a taste that's new to you and readers, so much the better. This is an example not of mine, but of another writer. It was like thin, moist, eggy bread pudding with a clear amber brown syrup, tasting halfway to brown sugar and the rest of the way to Vermont. So the next one is smell, like taste. Recall smells of the place that are both familiar and lesser known and difficult to describe. Try new combinations of the familiar to convey a new experience. So mention negatives, the whiff of sewage, the iron tang of the water, the cellar's mustiness. There are smells that are very pleasant, of, you know, bread that's freshly baked or whatever. But as we know, there are also smells that are not nice and that we would perhaps rather not, you know, that we would want to escape from. And then there are smells that kind of maybe you don't have any strong feelings about, but that nonetheless seem to kind of conjure up a memory of this particular location, this particular time of your life, if you like. Also touch, remember some of the physical feelings of the travel, of the journey you took into the place that you're talking about. This can be hot and cold, rough and smooth, these sorts of binaries that seem to kind of define our experience very often. Things that you touch, things that you pick up, but also things that touch you. So the breeze of the wind, raindrops that kind of fall on you, the rim of a glass when you're drinking something. And again, try to capture the unusual textures of things, the yak's coat, the palm trunk, the killing rug. And then to finish off, I want you to do some more abstract ones. This is a category that we can call bodily. So the body position when you were traveling or when you were in this place. Were you awkward, comfortable, stretched, cramped, turned, straight? Jot some memories of your travels, for instance, crouching in a corner of the pickup truck with the other hikers' backpacks, pressing into your spine, or the opposite of that, spread-eagled, luxuriating in the acreage of a king-sized bed. And then what we might call inner visceral. This is similar to both touch and bodily, but interior sensing in body organs, gut reactions, the feeling inside of you, if you like. Whether you had a churning stomach, tight throat, full bladder, scratchy eyes, prickling scalp. These sort of internal feelings that you get when you think of that particular place. Okay, well, that is that. I hope you've enjoyed it. And I hope at some point I will see you in person, and that you will get something out of this, and that you may want to certainly do the exercise, and certainly in future write more about yourself and your own experiences and your engagements with the world. Thanks very much.